Hello and welcome to Love is the Message, a podcast about music, the dance floor, sound systems and countercultures. I'm Jeremy Gilbert. I'm here as usual with my friend Tim Lawrence. Hi Tim.
Hi Jem.
And today we are going to be carrying on with the theme we started looking at last time. We're going to be carrying on talking about Eurodisco in 1977. Partly a topic which we find hard to talk about with a straight face. For some reason we decided, well, we know why we decided to make this 3 episodes, because we always end up stretching out these topics and having a lot to say.
And now you're worried that
this is one of very few occasions where we've gone into an episode with me thinking we probably said everything we had to say about this music last time.
I predict we're going to run over time.
You're probably right. And also, because what we're not doing yet, listeners, we're not letting you listen to Donna Summer. You're not hearing all. We know anyone with any familiarity with this area will be waiting with bated breath for us to talk about the epic classic, which is Donna Summer's "I Feel Love." But we're not. But before you can enjoy that, you've got to spend most of an episode listening to Boney M.
Hey, I can't believe you're putting down the best music in the show.
I'm not putting down Boney M. I like the charming. We like them. They're fun, but they're hardly the sublime. They hardly touch the sublime reaches of Summer and Moroder. Anyway, never mind. Let's defer that gratification and get on with the show. Tim, Tim's really in charge of all the research for this one. I'm just sitting here wisecracking,
smirking.
So Tim, you take it away.
Last show was an interesting one, but there was something a bit miscellaneous about it in the way we kind of got into the thematic. We were trying to talk about some of the distinguishing features of Eurodisco, the kind of more pronounced 4 on the floor, which, moved away from what we could call polyrhythm or syncopation, the use of orchestras, but then we obviously understood that the use of the orchestra string sections is hardly new in this music and in disco, but also in US music basically. So I just wanted this for the intro this time to look a little bit more at this topic through what we could call a sort of colonial analysis, just briefly, to try to begin to understand to what extent this is played out in disco and Eurodisco. I also did write a piece, not maybe a year ago, or maybe it was 2 years ago, which looked at this, which was called Decolonizing Disco. And it was just trying to understand the way in which disco itself, not only Eurodisco was itself, had sort of some colonizing elements. So, and we also now are living in a moment where, well, it's not exactly new, but it's particularly heightened at the moment. This kind of idea for all sorts of obvious reasons. So just want to recap that a little bit. Colonialism, or a colonial imaginary, doesn't straightforwardly just begin with Eurodisco, although it comes through more clearly with that. To be colonial or behave like a colonialist is to take something that's not yours because you think you've got a right to it, and to make out and to sort of justify this because you think you're superior. So, this goes back to the long history of, European colonialism of the Southern Hemisphere. And then the process itself is that you can either co-opt what is colonized as if it was yours all along, dress it up as basically being kind of, the invention of white people, or rightly the property of white people, or you reduce it to a caricatured otherness. This is the work of Edward Said and Orientalism, Fanon and all sorts of other critics. So I don't think that, if we go back to the beginning of the dance scene, or the contemporary sort of DJ-led dance scene, 1970, which we've done a number of series ago, and we look at, say, what was happening with African and Latin music within this dance scene. I mean, clearly it was self-consciously integrated, but not as something that was to be subsumed or to be owned within this matrix that was emerging. It was a very open sensibility, and there was a desire to embrace this music as basically as being progressive, as progressive, if not more progressive, than a lot of other music that was coming through at the time, including from the United States. And it included, there was a lot of Afro elements in particular, and the leading example of this is Manu Dibango's Soul Makossa, but there was really scores and scores of records. We listened to a bunch of them that have kind of pronounced Afro. It's a lot of the time with African musicians, say, living in Europe, recording this music. I think one of the things, just to touch on very briefly, is that when disco emerged in sort of 1974 and 1975, it sort of partly, developed its own sounds by taking this group of different genres and sounds that were being played on these dance floors in the early 1970s, and deciding that kind of what disco was a kind of, a new invention. And it didn't sort of declare its kind of, its origins very clearly, if you like. So there was a sort of mild form of colonization going on with this. Really, it's kind of, and it's also partly to do with just like capitalism. There was a market for this music in New York City. There was music infrastructure of independent record companies that could make the most of it, and disco just emerged. And to a certain extent, it's clear that it's 1974 and 1975. Music that was recorded outside of the United States started to kind of make fewer inroads into the New York market. And the formation of the record pool kind of started to sort of accelerate that. That was kind of more around 1976. The one trade route that really remained open outside of, the US internal market was to Europe, basically. And it was through this that you have, Giorgio Moroder and Donna Summer, of course, recording Love to Love You Baby. We didn't mention this in the last show. We might touch on it in the next show. But just to sort of say, I think in many respects, I don't know what you think about this, Jem, maybe, but I don't think it's not a Eurodisco record. I mean, we all know that it gives new pronunciation or prominence to the 4 on the floor B. Giorgio Moroder partly did this because he was recording for a German audience and he felt they wouldn't be able to dance to anything else. But it basically it really sounds like what we could call a black record. It's got an incredible sort of groove. It's got a lot of feel. It's also quite slow, which is interesting. So it kind of has more of a kind of a sort of funkier feel because of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't really hear it as Eurodisco.
Still the convention, Fly Romy Fly, is more Eurodisco. It's kind of got a bit of a boring beat. It's sort of really very simple and a sort of inane melodic line that plays out on the strings.
Well, I'm fond of it because my daughter's called Robin, so when she was little, we used to play it at home. It's not a good record, though, really.
I know.
I mean, I like the idea of that as an image, building an entire disco record around the image of a robin flying. I just think it's not beyond that. It seems like the idea wasn't really developed beyond that pitch,
Yes.
Well, it's a disappoint. I mean, it's a record that it does disappoint. Like every time I've ever listened to it, like I start off really liking it, and by the end of it, it's dull.
So anyway, these are the origins of music recorded for dance consumption in Europe, making significant inroads into the United States, in particular New York. Anyway, this is just to look at this kind of emergence, really. I think of like how in the first 5 or 6 years of the 1970s, you just have these shifts going on in music, and a very prominent position initially for music recorded outside of the United States, and in particular music that is African or Latin oriented coming through, and then that slows down while Europe, music recorded in Europe seems to kind of, gain more momentum. This is by the mid-70s. And so it really took us up to what we covered in the last show, where we looked at the kind of orchestral roots of this sound. And we looked at what were, in many respects, seen to be kind of, quite progressive manifestations of Eurodisco, with Cerrone and Alec Kostendinos in particular leading this kind of work, and Casablanca Records becoming this somewhat improbable independent label that will go on during 1977 to become the best-selling kind of label in disco by far, and one of the best-selling labels in the United States. So Eurodisco has these, these different kind of elements that get to be foregrounded, and I think it's fairly explicit that it undermines the kind of an African element, the African American element of disco. In particular, it shifts away from the rhythm section or the groove element, puts this additional emphasis on simpler melodic lines and string sections and a simpler beat. I don't think it's particularly good music. It doesn't appeal to me overall. So I'm a bit wary of being critical of it necessarily because I just don't like it hugely. But anyway, we get onto the music of Jacques Morali and Henri Belolo. I assume is pronounced Henri. He's a French guy born in Morocco, but of a French family, and the Ritchie family and the Village People, in particular, being their kind of main projects. We will end with the Village People, and I kind of have not the Village People, Boney M. And I still like Boney M when I hear them, so that'll be an interesting one to explore maybe. But let's hear some music before we go any further, and we are going to start with the Ritchie family. So let's have a listen to the Ritchie family's Istanbul, not Constantinople.
It is interesting to me, this music, and all of it, for the reasons, because the description you've given of it, I think, is really accurate, and it clearly sonically sort of anticipates what will become really mainstream EDM to this day, like having gone through the kind of process of becoming digitized and electronic and having sort of become trance and then become a more generic kind of laptop rave music, mostly for white people. And then even, I mean, really, not only white people, actually. I mean, one of the things that's been really noticeable over the past 10, 15 years is that particular current of like fall to the floor, hands in the air sort of EDM became something that some hip hop producers were drawing on and kind of playing around with. There were various kind of style features in coming out of American press and magazines talking about how more people of color and more people coming out of the hip hop scene were taking MDMA, for example, about 10 years ago, that was sort of associated with that. So it's almost as if this has gone a sort of full circle, because for me, one of the things that really characterizes that sound, when I think about it over most of that history, is I associate it really with white producers, white artists. It's a kind of whitening of the music. I always remember Ewan Pearson, like when we were one of the first times I ever met him. Ewan Pearson, very well-known producer. He and I wrote a book together in 1999. Still a friend. And I remember him telling me about this imaginary device a friend of his had invented called the honky box. And the honky box would de-funkify, would extract and remove, bleach out all the funk from any piece of music that was put through it. And this was like, and this was how you got trance, as you basically put Detroit techno or something through the honky box, and that's what came out the other side. So the sense that you associate this kind of musical linearity, like, with a certain kind of musical whiteness, has been really profound for me. But of course, the elite and the producers and most of the actual instrumental musicians on this record, I guess, are white, although the people singing are not.
I should introduce the producers, really. I mean, it's Jacques Morali. And so he got into the music business in the late 60s. He was writing music for orchestras in Paris. He was involved with the Parisian Cabaret. I think it was somehow a strip club called Crazy Horse. Performed there, I think, as a solo artist. And he moved to the United States and I believe went to even live in Philadelphia, or somehow became familiar with Philadelphia International. And it was in 1975 he met this guy, Henri Belolo. I mean, Belolo, in terms of at least the Ritchie family's Istanbul, not Constantinople. Belolo was born in Casablanca, Morocco, and he was the son of a sailor and a model. So his parents were French. He has this kind of experience of growing up, partly, I guess, listening to apparently Charles Aznavour and Edith Piaf, but also Moroccan noir music. I don't know the detail, but there's this experience of growing up, as a white person in a colonial outpost, basically, and how that filters through. And I guess there's, various power relations are in play that we can only imagine about. But anyway, Belolo got involved with music and DJing and production in Paris, and then went back to Casablanca, and he started a license US music for Europe. And in 1973 moved to New York because it was emerging as this kind of, it already was, but it was becoming even more powerfully developed as a music city, and met Morali in early 1975. And it was Morali who suggested that they could start this band that came to be known as the Ritchie family. Morali is the key figure within it. Belolo's role, as far as I can tell, is increasing as each new album is released. But the idea was very much to write this kind of dance music that was inspired by, 1940s musicals and Carmen Miranda, and just kind of elements of big band jazz, really. And I think there's a kind of flamboyance to the whole sound that can work. But I don't know, within the Ritchie family, for me, it gets a little bit kind of predictable. Anyway, we've listened previously on a much earlier episode to their debut album, Brazil. And on that, Morali is the producer and Belolo is the general supervisor. We listened to that back in an episode when we're looking at the kind of commercialization of disco in 1975, and that was an example we gave of that. The Ritchie family features 3 vocalists. They were uncredited on, I think, the debut album, so we should mention them here, really. Barbara Ingram, Carla Benson, and Yvette Benton. But we'd already played something from Brazil, which is why I thought we might listen to the Istanbul record, which is from their second album, which is titled Arabian Nights. This album featured new vocalists who are credited: Gwendolyn Oliver and Cassandra Wooten, and a third woman, Cheryl Mason Jacques. The best known record from this album is called The Best Disco in Town, and it's a medley of basically disco hits, recent disco hits, plus with an original chorus. And because we're talking about Eurodisco and we're thinking a little bit about colonialism, I thought it'd be more interesting to listen to the Istanbul record than the Best Disco in Town record. The Best Disco in Town record is very, very cheesy and very, very commercial. It's like that kind of, that Stars on 45 thing, but not as good. We have talked about Stars on 45 at some point, haven't we? By accident, maybe. They did these, I can't remember when these records started to come out. It must have been early 80s, so we haven't got there in the chronology yet, but they would do like all of ABBA's biggest hits put on a 7-inch single, basically, with eight beats per record or something like that. They did the same for the Beatles. So I remember as a kind of 13-year-old kid quite liking this stuff. And Frankie Knuckles used one of the Stars on 45 records at the warehouse to kind of create some beats, basically, that he could mix with, I think. So this Best Disco in Town is very much in line with that kind of aesthetic. But I think the thing that's interesting is that it's even if we're in the Ritchie family's imagining of something which is set or meant to evoke Istanbul, it doesn't really have kind of anything within it that is straightforwardly recognizable as as locally produced music. The album itself is supposed to represent a journey from Istanbul to a track that's called Lawrence of Arabia to a Persian market. It's very disco-y. It's got a very childlike sort of melody, lots of big band elements, as we've heard on Istanbul, not Constantinople. It's very sort of quite fake, poppy, cheesy. One of the things that comes out of this is that, you know, it's something. There's something about it that's entirely natural, or not something that we might question, in which white producers appropriate Moroccan and Turkish and Middle Eastern culture and reduce it to some kind of cliche, like, you know, the simplest possible melodic line maybe that's supposed to signify something that's kind of Eastern, and that this becomes a focal point for kind of, you know, Western entertainment and giggling pleasure.
Well,
basically.
I think that's a good point, yeah. But this could also be seen as the beginnings of a sort of postmodern sensibility in pop music that's going to become explicit with the new pop and elements of new romanticism and the sort of, or maybe it's already begun to an extent with glam and Bowie and things like that. So the idealization of travel and glamour, like precisely because of their superficiality, because they don't implicate you in anything that's trying to be meaningful relationships to the world or other people. I mean, it's already there in some Roxy Music songs, and it's going to become a key theme in sort of British new pop in the early 80s. So,
okay, let's introduce the next one, and this next one we're going to play is Ritchie Family, African Queens.
This I have actually got, I have to say. The thing about these records is they're all these little mini symphonies. So they're all these little breaks and parts, and quite often they'll have at least a section that's pretty interesting, I think. The percussion gets a bit more complicated or something. But, you know, I keep saying this, it's sort of proto high energy, you know, fall to the floor, quite fast, very energetic, quite a lot of drama. These different passages come and go in order to create a sense of drama on the dance floor. This always makes me wonder, really, in a way, like who is it for? What is the precise context for which this is being created? And I sort of think I do think this is people dancing on sort of combinations of cocaine and quaaludes or something. That's sort of low attention spans, like wanting lots of stimulation, something physically easy. That is sort of how I imagine it.
Yeah, I've never really imagined who might be like enjoying it, but it's a good question. I mean, we're in 1977, so this is partly about, you know, the acceleration of disco within popular culture. You know, we've already gone through Studio 54 opening. I can't remember exactly how many discotheques open in the United States by this point, but it's, you know, thousands and thousands will have been opening, and they're looking for music to come through, and they want it to be like, it's supposed to be fun, basically, easy to dance to, as you say, kind of quite, you know, seemingly exciting. I think it's probably worth remembering that we spend a lot of time thinking about the culture of the loft, or the Paradise Garage opens in 1977, what's going on at the Gallery or the Warehouse in Chicago, where people might dance for 8 hours and get deep into a kind of journey with all these different types of music perhaps being played as well. And I mean, what was going on in most of the United States is people would still be dancing for, you know, for relatively short bursts of time. There'd be these kind of discotheques opening up all over. A lot of the culture wasn't even necessarily cocaine and quaaludes, but it was probably still alcohol. It was just a way of socializing and a fun kind of thing. You know, the same group, you know, people are sort of dancing also dancing the hustle. That's becoming more popular. So I think there's the wider popular terrain is not maybe quite enjoying it. And I think to a certain extent this plays into an element of the scene that we haven't really spent too much time on this particular series, but that's the white gay scene that has become very important within New York City in particular, and within what's understood to be the rising disco market. So I think it appeals there. I mean, one thing about this record is it's called African Queens. I mean, and in fact, the album is called African Queens, and then the opening track is African Queens.
And it is about African queens. The lyric is about African queens. They were yet another historically informative Eurodisco record.
I know. Well, this is partly this is one of the best examples of a ridiculously thematized Eurodisco record. So we have like the opening track is African Queens. Then we have the theme of Nefertiti, who was from the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt. Then we have Cleopatra. The theme of Cleopatra. Then we have the theme of the Queen of Sheba. Then we have a reprise of the African Queens. And then we have a couple of records. And then we get into something. The last track is called Voodoo. So it's this like pick and mix of titles. And then you kind of actually listen to the music. And it's very hard to distinguish anything that is even meant to be kind of, a stereotypical version of African
Yeah, they're
music.
not claiming it's African music. They're claiming it's disco. It's disco music inspired by the idea of these African queens, aren't they?
Well, you say that, but employed in this kind of boosted rhythm and percussion section is Olatunji, remarkably. So who would have thought that Olatunji? Now, if you're Olatunji, I don't know what to make of that. I mean, this is partly the problem of colonialism, or the appeal of a good freelance kind of commission, let's call it. I don't know on what conditions Olatunji is persuaded to participate in this record. I don't know what he was told that it was supposed to be. It's quite hard to understand what part of the record he's kind of necessarily contributing to.
Yeah, for anyone who doesn't remember from earlier series, Babatunde Olatunji is a Nigerian drummer.
Yeah, he's incredibly. He was the son of a diplomat who was based in the United States, and whilst he was doing his PhD, he needed to earn some money, so started a kind of West African sort of drumming outfit. And I think it is as early as 1959 released this album Drums of Passion, which was the first sort of West African styled recording to be released in the United States, and it became this incredibly important record at the Sanctuary and at the Loft, having not really received any previous play in kind of DJ-led party situations. So Olatunji is on this record, but it all feels somewhat sort of tokenistic. I mean, there's one of the records called Summer Dance, which is at the beginning of side B, includes some congas, and Voodoo, the last track, introduces something that is vaguely polyrhythmic, and it's makes a pretty brief appearance there. So. And I mean, but the other thing is what happens to kind of blackness within this kind of framework. I mean, it's a way. It's a primary way to kind of mark it, or it basically exoticizes this record, right? The album cover exoticizes this culture. So I mean, as we know, it portrays black culture as being as would go on to be the case in what comes to be known as world music, and I think the 1980s, is there anything that is related to sort of non-white culture is seen to be kind of ethnic or and traditional and kind of unmodern in terms of sound or in terms of instrumentation or in terms of clothing or the wider situation. So rather than there being, the idea there might be sort of cities in Africa is always about kind of, rural, stretches of rural land. So on this particular album cover, we have this kind of the three female vocalists are supposedly, represented, who are black women. are dressed up in the attire that is supposedly, traditional attire of ancient Egypt, for example, and Ethiopia. So there's a way in which, somewhat, in a very crass way, these two white French producers who've gone to live in the United States to basically enjoy and make some money out of disco are utilizing the iconography of black culture, and in particular African culture, not even African American culture, to kind of to exoticize and sell records that actually have no proper engagement with that culture at all.
All right, we've done half an hour on the Ritchie family. Let's get on to the most important.
Are you telling me you want to move on to the village people? Okay. So the village people, anyway, just to very briefly introduce them, and we can talk about the story of how the band forms. It's not even a band, really. Anyway, how the group formed. It's not even a group, really. How the name came into existence. We can talk about that in a bit. But just briefly, just to note that it was the co-creation of Jacques Morali and Henri Bololo, and they released their first album, their debut album, in 1977. So let's have a listen to this track titled "San Francisco."
Dress the way you please and put your mind at ease. It's a city known for its freedom. Cycle shining bright, break the silence of the night. Inhibitions, no, you don't need them. No. San Francisco. San Francisco. San Francisco. San Francisco. Hey, 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 you got me.
So this is Village People, the name being a very direct reference to Greenwich Village at the historical moment when Greenwich Village was well known for its what we would still call today a gay, in some places a gay village. And the song is anthemically celebrating San Francisco, also at the moment when it was historically closely associated with gay culture. And both of those associations don't last that long, really. Like 10 years earlier, 10 years later, if you say Greenwich Village, you might be well aware there are plenty of queer people and gay venues there, but it's not the thing you're thinking of when you hear the phrase Greenwich Village. And I think similarly, San Francisco probably, San Francisco's queer scene wasn't the main thing you thought of when you thought of San Francisco outside of a relatively short historical window. And so it's pretty interesting. Like this is the moment, 1977, really, when the kind of visibility of queer culture has reached the point where people can create these songs with these kind of knowing names, and they can be assumed to be understood at least by some of the audience as explicit celebrations of sort of out gay culture and really out gay male youth culture, really. I can tell you because I was born in San Francisco, weirdly, although we left when I was a baby. But when I would tell people this, there was a few years of my life when I was at school, even in the north of England, when I would mention this to people. The thing people knew about San Francisco in the northwest of England was it had loads of gay people, and that was the thing. But that didn't by the early 90s. That wasn't the thing. If you said San Francisco to someone, people were already starting to think actually of the sort of emerging sort of cyberpunk scene and the rave scene, the kind of hippies, tech. That kind of Bay Area thing, and that was a kind of resurgence of the thing people knew San Francisco for in the 60s up to the sort of mid 70s, which was the sort of hippie counterculture and its aftermath. So the specific identification of San Francisco, just the word San Francisco. I'm not talking about like the Castro, which of course is everybody always knows is a gay neighborhood. I'm talking about San Francisco. The word San Francisco, like the word Greenwich Village, just being a sort of byword for gay culture, those things don't last particularly long.
Sure. I mean, maybe I don't know if it's possible that Greenwich Village lasts longer than San Francisco, potentially. I mean, of course, what one of the things that will, goes on to dominate, most of the 1980s and at least the first half, if not longer, of the 1990s is the the emergence of HIV and AIDS, which heightens queer solidarity in a period of rising homophobia, and of course, an ever increasing death toll as well. So certainly for a period, this remains kind of and also during this period of period of great kind of expression, resistance. ACT UP emerges in New York, I think, in 1987. So, but it's not exclusive. But it's true. It may be that it's hard to really. I don't really feel like I know if there's a point where we can say that these are the identity of Christopher Street and the West Village sort of changes. But you're right. It's also true that it was historically quite mixed.
Yeah, well, I think this is the point I'm getting at. Really, they're both San Francisco and Greenwich Village are just metonyms for generalized bohemia, like for decades, like arguably going back to the early 20th century, like right through till very recent times, when they've become now metonyms for bohemia killed by gentrification. But what's happening at this precise moment in 77 is there's this kind of coincidence between this convergence between these bohemianism in general and sort of gay, again, really gay male youth culture, I'm going to say specifically, really in particular, which is interesting. I'm not making any point other than that it's kind of interesting to note that it's to note that this song being released by a band called Village People with this name is really emblematic of that, I think.
And it is absolutely, and it's when Jacques Morali, who I identified as gay, and Henri Bololo, who was straight, were walking down Christopher Street in New York, when Morali kind of noticed a Puerto Rican bartender who's called Philippe Rosé, who is dressed up as a Native American while working in this Christopher Street bar. And apparently they both followed him, Philippe Rosé, to the Anvil, which was this kind of, discotheque, which had sort of backroom sex, I think. And whilst they were there, having kind of followed Philippe Rosé, or Rose, that a customer walked in dressed in as a kind of Marlboro Man.
Like a cowboy,
style outfit. Yes, exactly. After the kind of, the famous ads that have been appearing. I'm not... certainly during the 70s. And this guy had a Stetson and a long moustache. And it was at this point, apparently, that Morali had the idea to form a gay archetype supergroup on the basis that gay men didn't have a group of their own.
That's so funny, aren't they? I'm just thinking, like, I want to, just for the benefit of any listeners who don't know, there's Village People were a huge pop phenomenon. They're this huge sensation. They had massive chart hits, both in Britain and the United States.
Donald Trump was playing
yeah, they're a mainstream chart pop. So, but of course, and their whole shtick is they do these songs full of suggestive themes, like pertaining to. And again, I'm going to keep saying male gay youth culture, because even at the time you get commentary from people around the kind of gay scene about how they're kind of embarrassing and they're about a very narrow version of queer identity. But anyway, these songs, they explicitly celebrate these famous sites of male homoeroticism. So the most famous hit is called In the Navy. The other big one is YMCA. The YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Associations, historically people where young men can go and they function as kind of hostels and they're used as gyms. But of course, in the early 70s, in major cities in the United States, they had become very well known as cruising sites. So, but this was completely, people outside the sort of queer and bohemian networks were totally oblivious to these meanings. So the Village People were performing YMCA in their like ridiculously sort of sexualized, like, homoerotic outfit on children's television in Britain on like a regular basis. They were just seen as people understood them as just producing this sort of party music, this sort of fun party music that you could play at a kid's birthday parties, because it was just sort of jolly music with jolly themes, like being in the Navy or hanging out at the YMCA, which of course that was part of my life as a kid in the northwest of England. The YMCA was the place you would go to play in the gym, or you'd go for a kind of indoor play session when I was kind of 8. So a song about YMCA seemed like completely innocuous, and it was just some men singing about how fun it was to play with your friends at the YMCA, which was literally a thing that I did and loads of other people did. And the point is, queer culture was so invisible still at that time, like within the public domain, that people who presented in ways which to anyone over the age of 8 in this country now are clearly kind of visible and legible as gay. Instead, they presented in the broad sort of sphere of popular culture, they presented as sort of asexual, because they obviously weren't performing a kind of conventional mode of heterosexuality. They just seemed to be sort of childlike to a lot of people. It's kind of extraordinary. It's really sort of interesting.
I mean, we might come back to it in when we get to 1978 or 1979, but I think we should listen just briefly. Let's listen to YMCA.
It's fun to stay at the YMCA. It's fun to stay at the YMCA. They have everything for you men to enjoy. You can hang out with all the boys. It's fun to stay at the YMCA. It's fun to stay at the YMCA. You can get yourself clean. You can have a good meal. You can do whatever you feel. Young man.
But it's the main anthem played by Trump during the US election campaign and at his victory rally. And also, I mean, the village people performed YMCA. Now, we're going to come on to the fact that the village people don't actually really exist. So to say they performed...
They were always just a cast of dancers, dancing around to the music that these producers that you've been talking about.
But it is extraordinary that Donald Trump would be kind of, kind of playing this kind of music. I mean, it's in a way, it's not extraordinary at all as well.
No, I heard it as a sort of expression of Donald Trump's roots. I mean, Donald Trump, socioculturally, he comes out of, the uptown New York kind of cocaine-driven party scene of like the early 80s. Like that's where he comes from. That's where he grew up. And I heard it as really a sort of, quite unashamed expression of that sort of identity, whether that was conscious or otherwise. I'm sure that wasn't conscious. I'm sure nobody sat down and thought, how should we celebrate Trumpism? We should play the records they were playing in like cheesy nightclubs uptown in 1981. But I think on some level that's what happened. That's what happened. That's why they played that record.
I don't know. We're not obviously going to get into an analysis of the US election here or what Donald Trump is or isn't. But one thing that seems to come out of this quite obviously is that Trump did better than Kamala Harris when it came to giving people who were feeling as though they hadn't, let's say, kept up with, the cost of living, thanks to 30% inflation or 2 years or whatever it may have been, and felt ignored or struggling. And, and this, the lyrics of this song are, young man, there's no need to feel down. That kind of feel good kind of element that Trump succeeded in tapping into, and Kamala Harris didn't really, because she said nothing, it's all okay. I'm not going to change anything. This the YMCA kind of works pretty well on that basis, I guess.
So what do we say then about their actual music? I mean, really, the only commentary I've ever read by anyone on Village People's actual music is Richard Dyer in defense of disco, just sort of, barely able to contain his absolute distaste for them as a phenomenon and their sound. So this is, I'm sure we've mentioned this before on the show, and we have yet to do an entire episode about it, but great British cultural critic Richard Dyer wrote a very famous short essay in a magazine called Gay Left in 1979 called In Defense of Disco, which really lays out the terms of reference for a sort of materialist music criticism, which anticipates a lot of later work in music musical cultural studies and critical musicology. It's a very powerful piece of work. But of course, he wants to make clear in writing that the disco he is talking about is more the kind of thing, more the kind of thing Tim likes, more the kind of thing I like, less and absolutely not at all the kind of thing that village people are doing, because indeed he hears village people as like tedious, boring, embarrassing, and also extremely macho. So that for Dyer, what's exciting about disco is what he calls its all-body eroticism. It's kind of androgynous or polysexual qualities, which he sees as continuous with a liberatory form of gay becoming, if you like. But what Dyer, being a good radical critic writing in 1979, is already quite conscious of, I think, is that, well, homoeroticism can go in a quite different way. It can go away from sort of polysexuality and androgyny towards an implicitly even quite misogynistic sort of just celebration of masculine archetypes and kind of masculinism as the only mode of eroticism and the only mode of self-expression. And I think for Dyer, like for a lot of gay critics at the time, that's sort of what's going on with village people. And you can hear that in the music. This very it's very sort of it's not as linear as the sort of most of the Eurodisco we've been talking about. It's not really sort of proto high energy. It's more this very specific sound, which kind of has more of an affinity to kind of rock, actually. It's got more of an affinity to someone like Queen in a way, I think.
Well, I don't know. To me, this is very Eurodisco-y in a sense. I mean, I think the one thing I would say that's clearest is its embrace of archetypes as a marketing mechanism. So that's clearly what was going on with the Ritchie family, with its kind of use of colonial representation. And some elements of musicality just there within a kind of, within a commercial Euro matrix, effectively, with the other being kind of co-optable and disposable as suits the kind of invisible producer. I mean, it's the same here. The producers are invisible. The village people is entirely their concoction. Once again, we have archetypes in this case, instead of kind of being archetypes from the Middle East or from Africa, we have archetypes of gay culture. We have the Native American, the Marlboro, the kind of cowboy, the construction worker, the leather man.
There's the leather guy that really gives it away.
I think there's.
I mean, because the rest of them could just be characters from a Richard Scarry book. Everyone's jobs. It's the leather guy who makes it like impossible to escape. This is like.
They could be sort of characters out of Legoland or something, I suppose. Sure, no, and that's the point. I mean, part of the point is that they're not explicitly gay. They're not explicitly out. I remember. It's kind of sometimes hard to remember because I wrote it 20 years ago or published it 20 years ago. Wrote it almost, but in Love Saves the Day, I was kind of discussing all of this, and they weren't, when there were interviews with the village people about whether they were gay or not, they were very evasive about this. It wasn't a kind of they weren't like Sylvester.
No,
it was kind of out and proud, effectively. So they were always trying to, market to a mass audience, which they did incredibly successfully, whilst appealing to this kind of emerging gay constituency. I think it's very safe to say that their appeal was to the white gay crowd rather than the black gay crowd. I do find the music is very pumpy and quite commercial. It's probably should be said that this first album was seen to have a certain degree of credibility within I think we can safely say, the white gay scene. This was not being played at the Loft or the Paradise. Not that they were even the black gay scene as such yet. Let's say Better Days was a black gay club. The T. Scott was not being playing the Village People. But I find I do find it in its kind of dynamism, very kind of very Euro disco oriented. And it's kind of use of basically this sort of pumping 4 on the floor rhythm upon which various kind of, quite often quite simple sort of melodic lines and lyrics are laid over as being quite typical of a lot of Eurodisco. It's certainly got a pounding kind of sensibility, and it's not, it doesn't have anything that's kind of, you would sort of say is funky. Funk oriented. Anyway, so that's the Village People.
Okay, so what's next?
So I think one of the points to be made about the Village People is that it's released on Casablanca, and it's part of Casablanca's kind of rise to prominence as the best known, most prolific label of disco. Now, Giorgio Moroder was also working with Casablanca, of course, by this point. Donna Summer released a number of albums during 1977 that, of course, produced by Giorgio Moroder. So we are going to talk about I Feel Love, but I think to really grasp what was going on with Eurodisco, we need to talk about those albums a little bit more generally. We're going to do that in the next episode. Not space to do that this time around. So just to conclude this particular show, which is a little bit more oriented about, music that is still, let's say, coming out potentially, at least initially, out of Europe. By this point, Giorgio Moroder is definitely very much living in the United States. But just to wrap up the show, I thought we'd talk about Boney M, which is quite another quite interesting group. I mean, I grew up listening to this stuff as a kid. I was born in 1967. Boney M started to break through probably in 1976. They started to kind of come out with some records. So I was 10 years old, and it was, we all, I kind of liked this stuff as a 10-year-old. One of the funny or bizarre things is that I could listen to this music again, let's say driving around North Wales with my daughters on a camping trip where we even happened to meet up with you and Joe and your daughters last summer, Jem, and we could listen to Boney M on the radio, and I can still really enjoy this music in the way that I enjoy ABBA, for example. So I haven't really worked out entirely why I might kind of still quite like this music. But before we get into trying to analyze this too deeply, let's hear a bit more music, and we'll start off with Boney M's Ma Baker, which is released in 1977.
She was the meanest cat in our Chicago town. She was the meanest cat. She really mowed them down. She had no heart at all. No heart at all. She was the meanest cat. Oh, she was really tough. She left her husband flat. He wasn't tough enough. She took her boys along, but they were mean and strong. Ma Baker, she taught her four sons. Ma Baker, to handle their guns. Ma Baker, she never could cry. Ma Baker.
So just to kind of try and take the story of Boney M forward a little bit, they released their first record in 1976, which I think was Daddy Cool. If you, Jem, and any of our listeners have not yet watched both of the Paddington movies, I really, really, really recommend you do so. They are two of my favorite ever movies, and definitely the movies I've watched more than any other movie by far. And every time I watch it, it's like watching them for the first time. So they're incredibly good. Anyway, having got that out of the way, I only mention them, sorry, because Daddy Cool appears very hilariously in Paddington 2. So anyway,
it's good to know. I've seen that.
That's an incentive to. I've
seen the first one. I haven't seen the Daddy Cool sequence.
Did you enjoy?
Yeah,
did you enjoy the first one? It's fine. Oh my God! This is the first. I think this is like maybe the first crisis of our friendship.
I got no problem with it.
Oh my God! Anyway, moving on swiftly. So anyway, Daddy Cool's released in '76. They also did a cover of Sunny in 1976. A cover of Bobby Hebb's original, which is obviously a beautiful record. So Boney M covered that. And they were the invention of a producer called Frank Farian, who started Boney M just as a studio project with no other members, as far as I'm aware, in 1975. I assume he got some instrumentalists in to help him lay down the music, unless he's a multi-instrumentalist. I never got that far in the research of checking that out. But he was recording, I think the first record may have been Baby, Do You Want to Bump? And there was some demand for performance of the track on TV shows, and that led Frank Farian to form something that resembled a group. And they had a lineup that featured Maisie Williams, Marcia Barrett, Bobby Farrell, and Liz Mitchell, who were employed basically to lip sync and dance over the records. Yeah, so the idea was really just to kind of it was what was becoming quite familiar already in disco, which was, you have a producer creates a sound, and it's the same as the Village People. There's no one to actually kind of deliver that sound in a live situation, and so you kind of employ dancers, singer, actor types really to come in and pretend that they are part of a group. And in this particular case, all of the singers, or all of the lip syncers, I should probably say, and dancers were black. So this is really on some level it. I mean, I think there's this kind of, I think on some, what we're dealing with here is a very strange, phenomenon really, which is, a white producer employing black dancers to basically ventriloquize his music and to give it some impression that it may be black oriented music. And in this case, they're not even delivering the music. So we've had this long standing kind of situation where there's a white male dominance in the recording studio, and that's continuing in this particular instance. But here there's also there's the added duplicity, if you like, that black people are employed not to even deliver the vocals in a way that they might be deemed to bring some sort of musical quality to the recording, but here just kind of to lip sync. So what this might say in terms of our theme of colonialism, I'm not too sure, although maybe the answer is quite explicit. It's a charade. It's an exploitation of the kind of signification of blackness to add a certain level of kind of cool, or a certain level of supposed musical sensibility to something that had nothing to do, no relation to that music whatsoever. And at the same time, I don't, as far as pop music goes, I find it quite endearing.
Well, I do as well, but I think you have to say, Farian is a very talented. He was a talented producer and arranger and songwriter, and he was quite immersed in black music. So Boney M wasn't just trying to reproduce disco for a European audience; it was doing a quite unique synthesis of disco and funk and reggae and sort of European pop like ABBA. So it brings together all those elements in quite a unique synthesis, and it does produce this distinctive and compelling sound that everybody loves. And there are loads of their hits are more sort of reggae records than they are disco. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the Rivers of Babylon.
So they're heavily and they're always influenced by funk as well. There's a sense they're sort of coming out of funk, and actually they sort of present early on as more like a funk group. So I think it is that the synthesis of elements that the achieves is sort of pretty convincing. It's very distinctive, and it is very accessible to a lot of people. And I think there's a lot of people, also for a lot of audiences in Europe, I think in particular, in Britain, there's a lot of people like my age. It's some of the first music you can remember from the charts from when you're very little, and it was a sort of gateway into listening to things like reggae and funk, as well as more than disco, actually, for a lot of people. So it was, I think for all those reasons, they are really interesting. But there's something to be said about the fact that there's this pretty consistent history of these German producers and musicians like finding a take on American musical styles, which is quite distinctive, and which is in a way which, for example, really with a few exceptions, like French, Italian sort of producers and musicians didn't particularly. So I think there is. I don't know what the reason for that is. I think you'd have to go into a really detailed history of the sort of club and music scenes in those places and their kind of different reference points, and also the fact that I think it's not that French people aren't doing really interesting music; it's that they're doing it in other places at that particular time, for example. So there is a sort of interesting history there that we've traced a little bit on the show, on different episodes of the show, going back to sort of krautrock at the beginning of the 70s. So for me, it does sort of fit into that history a little bit. And looking ahead to next time, then obviously it's Giorgio Moroder, the German producer, who's going to be the person who really becomes the sort of transition point between Kraftwerk and Eurodisco in its synth-driven form, which is the form which is going to take in its more developed incarnation, and the form in which, for better or worse, it's going to impact upon global sort of popular music to this day.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we will at some point come more explicitly into this terrain as well, but it goes back, you know, at least a century or thereabouts, where there's this kind of, the dynamic is one of love and theft, as the book title has it, where you have the kind of white musicians or producers, loving black music, being attracted to it, and then let's say stealing from it, or borrowing heavily, or not attributing, or etc. But it's both.
I guess it is really interesting that at this juncture, that it's really important for all of these guys that they seem to be, in some sense, authentically black. They have these black performers hired to be the front people, because of course that, at other times in history that hasn't been the case. At other times in history, it's been the case that white people playing basically black music, were much more like respectable and made a lot more money because they were white and they looked white. So there is something quite distinctive going on in this moment, that you've got these white production teams who using black artists. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it is one feels very ambivalent about it, doesn't one? Because it's sort of icky in a way, and appropriative, but also it's kind of interesting that should be seen as a desirable thing, that blackness is considered desirable and is considered a marker of authenticity at this particular moment.
Yeah, but it's the question is always what blackness is desirable. I mean, at the same time, as we've covered for the patrons, resistance through rituals, you have the emergence of this kind of idea of the young black man being an inherent danger and criminal. So the blackness that is being foregrounded here is an exoticized blackness that is kind of highly caricatured, stereotypical. Some might even say racist. So I mean, I do find that the use by the Ritchie family, their caricatures of the Ritchie family, are far more explicitly racist than in Boney M. Boney M is more trying to present itself as as a kind of as black, as a form of black musicians. I mean, the fact they're asked to lip sync is kind of obviously is extremely demeaning, and the power relations within the band are always clear. As soon as Frank Farian wanted to disband the band, he did on his own terms, and that was that. There was no kind of way forward for the the lip syncing dancing performers who carry the image of the band. So the power relations are very are obviously quite problematic as well. I mean, there's this kind of professor who is based in the United States, in fact, at the University of Michigan, Kira Thurman, who's delivered what seems to be sort of a paper, and maybe not yet an article, about disco and what she calls Black Europe and the remaking of the music industry. The title is On Musical Masquerade and Mimicry. It was delivered at Berkeley, this paper in October of last year. There are layers of complexity to this argument, but there is this sort of celebration of the rise of black performers within Eurodisco, and I do feel like I need to sort of pause before embracing this argument. I mean, they're there, in many respects as kind of ventriloquist, indeed sort of puppet-like ventriloquizers. I mean, what I will say is that there is I do feel like in doing this research, I discovered a Boney M record that I'd never come across before, called New York City. So I thought we might end with that. because it's actually an example of how Boney M and as you were saying, Jem, this producer Frank Farian do develop a kind of as a range. I still kind of pop oriented music, but it's a lot more. It's got more subtlety and variety than a lot of Eurodisco. So let's have a listen to Boney M, New York City.
New York City. Oh baby, finance. Here we come. New York City. Just for fun.
I think it's another great record, actually. I mean, it's a good record anyway. It's sort of funky and it's spacey. It's kind of got an explorative kind
I agree.
of feel. And yeah, given that we have been focusing on New York City during this series, if taking a little mini break from that by looking at Eurodisco as it emerged, I thought it was a good way to end this particular episode.
Yeah, it's a really interesting record. That is one you could almost imagine that being played at the Loft.
Definitely. I was looking at the YouTube comments while I was listening to it, and one of them was like, "Did Larry Levan ever play this?" And I was like, "Well, there was no." And then someone said Music Box, so I thought, "Oh my goodness!" Like Ron Hardy played, and this comment had a lot of likes, and I was like, "Oh my goodness!" Ron Hardy played at the Music Box, and I could really believe that he did. Then I looked into it, and it wasn't. It's just there is a sort of house track that has a bunch of samples. And that track has got Music Box in the title, and it does sample from Boney M, New York City.
Wow. Okay.
But anyway, but briefly, I imagined it Ron Hardy's Music Box, but it's still possible to imagine it working on a dance
for sure.
floor.
Okay, well, thanks, Tim. That's really interesting. That was I was skeptical that we would find much to think about, but as usual, I was wrong. So that was really
You're not usually wrong, Jim.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks, everyone, for listening. If you found that interesting, if you haven't done before, please consider leaving us a good rating on the podcast app, maybe even becoming a Patreon and listening to the dozens of extra episodes we now have available, some of which we've already kind of alluded to today with our relatively recent episodes on things like glam and kraut rock. And whether or not you have time and resources to do any of that, thanks very much for listening. Thanks as ever to our fantastic producer Matt Huxley, and we'll be with you next time. Bye bye.
Bye bye.